Hello, and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's new internet show on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. My guest today, I'm so thrilled to welcome, is the great Noah Barkin, a senior visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund and managing editor at the Rhodium Group. Noah, welcome to the show, and thanks for being with us.
Great to be here, Rachel.
So you focus heavily on issues related to China and Europe and China and Germany. So that is what I wanted to talk to you about today. And for those of you tuning in, I also want to take a second to give a plug for Noah's newsletter, Watching China and Europe. It provides key insights on European policymakers' evolving thinking about China, and it's a must read for me, and I know a lot of other people. So quick plug on that. So just to kick this off, Noah, in your latest newsletter, you talked about how it's been nearly a year since the three parties in the German government unveiled a coalition agreement that basically promised a new approach to China. The parties came together. They condemned human rights abuses in Xinjiang. They talked about how concerned they were about Beijing's security crackdown in Hong Kong. They warned against changes to the status quo in the Taiwan Straits, and basically came down the line of saying we need to lessen dependencies on China. They said in the future, German foreign policy is going to be more consistent, let's say, on their China policy. But the reality has looked a lot different. So as someone who is based in Berlin, who watches this closely, what is going on with Germany's China policy, and what are you reading from where you sit?
Well, thanks, Rachel. Also, thanks for the plug. Very kind of you. German China policy is very complex, and sometimes it feels like it's one step forward, two steps backward. Sometimes two steps forward, one step backward. So, as you mentioned, a new government came into power in December. Unveiled a coalition agreement because there are three parties in the German government, which promised a shift from the Angela Merkel era, which had been under Merkel, Germany was very focused on engagement, trade and investment between Germany and China really increased exponentially during Merkel's term, and obviously at the end of her term, there was growing pushback against this policy. We saw it on 5G. We saw it on the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, which she sealed a sort of preliminary agreement, which is now on ice towards the end of her tenure. So the new government came in promising a different approach. In their coalition agreement, they talked about human rights. They talked about forging a more united European approach. We obviously this new government has been it's been a trial by fire with the war in Ukraine, and that's where most of their focus is. But the foreign ministry is working on a China strategy, which will be unveiled in the first half of next year. So China has been a focus, but what I think has become more clear over the last few months is that there is a big divide between some of the ministries, particularly the Foreign and Economy Ministry, which are run by the Greens, and the Chancellery and Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his team, who were a bit more reluctant to rock the boat with China. So this is a discussion that has been going on, and Olaf Scholz is now going to be traveling to Beijing at the beginning of November. So it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of messages he sends when he's there.
And what kind of messages do you think he's going to send when he's there? Because there's a couple things here. I mean, it seems like this trip to China isn't going to go down well in Washington, first of all. It also seems like German officials have been getting similar messages from German industry as they're getting from Chinese officials, which is that you leave the Chinese market at your own peril. So what kind of message do you think he's going to be sending when he gets there?
Well, everybody is waiting to see that. What we do know is this is going to be a very short trip. He's leaving on November 3rd, coming back on November 4th. We know that he's planning to bring an industry delegation with him, so a number of CEOs, which has raised some eyebrows. His ministers are working on a plan to reduce Germany's economic dependence on China. This is especially in the sort of the corporate domain. So some big German companies that are heavily invested in China, very dependent on China, and this gives China a degree of leverage. So this is something the new government is wrestling with. So Scholz going to China with an industry delegation will send a message to some people, I think, that it's sort of back to business as usual in Berlin. I don't think that's the case. I think Scholz, when he's in Beijing, is going to have to talk about some of the more contentious issues, Xinjiang, China's support for Russia. There's no way around this. But what Scholz does say and doesn't say is going to be very finely parsed here in Berlin, but also in other European capitals and in Washington and other allies. So people are watching this very, very closely. As you mentioned, there is a sort of a behind-the-scenes lobbying campaign going on, both from some of these big German companies that are heavily invested in China that don't want to see too radical of a shift in policy from the government. But also we've had some Chinese diplomats coming through town and issuing sort of thinly veiled threats to Germany, saying, if you guys follow through on this, reducing economic dependence and talking out more forcefully about human rights, then there are other countries out there that perhaps can take your place, because Germany has had a sort of privileged economic partnership with China in the past.
You mentioned a word that has, I think, echoed through many of the conversations over the last 7 or 8 months, and that's leverage. Germany is sort of coming to terms with the fact that Russia has major leverage over German energy policy. And I'm wondering, is there a discussion in Berlin right now about that same leverage that China has and could have in the next 10, 15, 20 years on Germany's economic policy? I mean, I can see a situation where fast forward down the road and Germany's sort of coming to terms with the fact that it made major mistakes on its China policy. And so I'm wondering if that resonates here and how that sort of plays out.
Yeah, well, absolutely. There is a debate about this. If you go on the political talk shows, which are very popular here in Germany, this is an issue which is really front and center. The energy ties between Germany and Russia are well known. Germany is in a very difficult situation now, being cut off from Russian oil and gas. And we're heading for what looks like a potentially very difficult winter here, with energy supplies still looking good, but we'll have to see how the winter unfolds. So there's the energy side of things, but also German companies had to pull out of Russia almost overnight because of sanctions, and because they felt they couldn't do business there anymore. And obviously, Germany has much closer economic ties with China than it does with Russia. Um, for some of these big German firms, especially the car makers, China is really an existential market. They make 40% of their revenues, upward of 40% of their profits there. So this is very much being talked about, especially after the U.S. Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and the Chinese reaction to that. Because obviously, if we had a conflict in the Taiwan Strait and Europe were to respond to that with economic sanctions, then firms could be in a similar position, being forced to cut ties with China. So this is not maybe going to happen in the next year or two, we hope, or even beyond that. But even if you think this could happen in 5 to 10 years, you have to begin preparing now. And I do know that in corporate boardrooms, this is something that is being discussed. Taiwan companies are working through Taiwan scenarios. And all that, so it is an intense topic of discussion here.
Yeah, I want to go back a minute to something we were talking about at the beginning, and this is the new China strategy that the foreign ministry is set to announce early next year. I think you mentioned
in the spring of next year. Yeah.
Okay, in the spring of next year, and the way that the German government works, I mean, it's not really the same as the U.S. government, where you have like the White House managing everything and approving everything. Like the foreign ministry basically has free reign over this. Obviously, they're consulting the coalition and working together, but this is a foreign ministry document, and I can imagine there's a sense of maybe there's some discomfort in the Chancellery with what that China strategy might say, especially given that the Greens, who are much more focused on issues like human rights, are the ones running the Chancellery right now. And so what do those conversations look like? I mean, is there a disconnect between where the Chancellery is and where the foreign ministry is on China, and how might that manifest itself in this new China strategy we're set to see?
Yes, I mean there are differences. The foreign minister Annalena Baerbock has been very clear that she sees risks in the close economic relationship between Germany and China. That she is committed to reducing strategic dependencies on China, and the foreign ministry and the economy ministry are talking right now about measures which would sort of reduce incentives for companies to invest in China. Germany has offered, the government offers investment guarantees to companies, not just in China but all over the world. But a lot have gone to China in recent years, and frequently to those companies that are already have a big footprint in China. So what they're really trying to do is to not necessarily tell companies you can't invest in China, but say the German taxpayer is not going to be there to rescue you if things go south. The Chancellery, Olaf Scholz, was elected on a platform of continuity. His message before, in the run-up to the election, was not much is going to change in foreign policy. Things haven't gone as planned. The war in Ukraine. And obviously he's being forced to also by some of his own ministers to grapple with the China challenge that Germany faces. Scholz did hold a big speech a few days after the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. People call this the Zeitenwende speech, a sort of new era, turning of the tide in German foreign policy. But interestingly, Scholz has not really made the link between his Zeitenwende, which involves more military spending, weapons to Ukraine, cutting off Russian energy, and China. But Baerbock, his foreign minister, has made this link, and so I think we're going to have to see. This China strategy is going to be a public document, which I think means that there's a risk that it doesn't lean too far out the window. And I think the Foreign Ministry has the lead on this, but this is going to go around to all the different ministries and the Chancellery will, in the end, have a chance to sort of take out its red pen and say, we don't like this and we don't like that. So I think the jury's still out on what this strategy is going to say.
That's interesting. You make a really good point with the Zeitenwende. I mean, for those of us who focus on the U.S.-German relationship, I mean, that's been the topic of discussion for 8 months. And you're right, it does go much deeper and farther than just spending more on military and investing in the Bundeswehr and like where to spend the $100 billion special fund. It does sort of like spread out into much broader questions about the role Germany plays and the role that it's going to play. And China, I think, has it needs to be part of this conversation. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. So sort of coming up to the end here, you also, do a lot of work on the Trade and Technology Council. And in your latest newsletter, you talked about the TTC a little bit. You mentioned how the Biden administration is preparing to ratchet up technology controls in a way that you said is likely to make life uncomfortable for its allies in Europe. You also mentioned that DC is sending a delegation to Berlin in the coming weeks, and that delegation is going to discuss, among other things, closer cooperation on export controls, outbound investment screenings, supply chains, but there is this sense in Europe that there's a growing U.S. protectionism and disdain for multilateral solutions. And so I wanted to mention or ask you about the TTC. It seems like we could be sort of getting to the point where it becomes a forum for discussion, but not much else because there are like major disagreements. So I wanted to ask you about how you see that playing out and if you see these roadblocks as stop signs or like red lights. Like how do we see that turning out?
Yeah, I mean, the TTC is a little over a year old. They've held 2 meetings, one in Pittsburgh, one outside of Paris. I think the Pittsburgh meeting sort of exceeded expectations. A very ambitious agenda was set out. I think Paris probably did not sort of meet those expectations, but there were reasons for that. I think both sides were very focused on the war in Ukraine, and so the next meeting, which is coming up, we think in by the end of the year, is a very important meeting. I think it's very important that the U.S. and the EU deliver some concrete steps forward, and there are 10 working groups. I won't go through all of them, but we're talking about export controls, investment screening, semiconductor supply chains, artificial intelligence, standards, data. So it's some very complex stuff, and we're gonna see at this upcoming meeting whether. And it's not about delivering across the board, but I think it's very important that both sides come up with 1 or 2 big deliverables. And Valdis Dombrovskis, the EU Trade Commissioner, is in Washington this week, meeting with Commerce Secretary, the USTR, Catherine Tai, and possibly Janet Yellen. So I think they're talking through some of the areas in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that Europe finds problematic, tax credits for U.S. companies that foreign companies can't benefit from, and also the TTC. And I think the U.S. export controls on technology, semiconductors, which were unveiled last week, are probably the beginning of a more intense discussion between Washington and Brussels, but also other European capitals on the technology relationship with China. And I think the U.S. I think for the past year and a half, we've been sort of waiting for signals from the Biden administration how they were going to handle this. Last week, we saw some steps that sort of indicated they're taking a very aggressive approach to this. And I'm not sure the EU is really ready for this discussion. So it's going to be interesting how that plays out in within the TTC.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And that'll definitely give us a good topic to come back to hopefully later this year after the TTC meets, and we can have this conversation again and talk about outcomes. So with that, I think we're out of time. So I'd like to say thank you to Noah Barkin for taking time out of your day to be with us, and to our audience, thank you for tuning in, and hope to see you next time at our next show on the Europe Center's Atlantic Debrief. Thanks so much.